All right, guys, I had another question on some of the approaches I've recently outlined and if they carry over to pentathlon. So, I guess there's sort of two approaches I've recently outlined. One is in the podcast about moving from amateur to professional, and the value of using different loads, um, heavy, light, and medium, or comp load instead of medium. And I also recently talked about indirect and direct training approaches for half marathon. So I thought I would sort of cover that briefly and also go over something I covered in a recent blog, which is exercise sequencing. In Australia, you can now do many lifts that were considered accessories in competition. And if you do all the different lifts over the year, you can win Lifter of the Year, which is a fantastic way for people to get involved and try different lifts. But you also need to be a bit careful because it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Because if you train for each lift individually, then it pulls you around and you probably don't optimize your classic events, and things like that. So we can sort of roll all of that into this one blog or podcast, I should say. So um, when it comes to direct versus indirect, again, training age and training experience is really important. Have you developed a general um, endurance or muscular size? How strong are your tendons? Are they used to whatever volumes and things like that? So pentathlon obviously has much more volume than if you're just doing a 10-minute event, long cycle, things like that. So that's something you have to get accustomed to. And then I think with this approach, it's important to work out if you're training specifically for pentathlon, or if you're doing pentathlon plus others. Or if you're an Australian doing Lifter of the Year, that's where that sequencing becomes really important, um, and going from there. But if your main focus is pentathlon and you only do pentathlons, I think it's absolutely fine to do the direct approach because you're doing so many different lifts anyway. It kind of lends itself to that. Whereas if you were doing um, a marathon long cycle one or two arm event, it could get quite monotonous if you only did that all the time. So, of course, pentathlon works really well as accessories or sort of general training for a variety of other different events. So, it really comes down to your goal. If you're doing more events or if pentathlon's not your focus, I think you'd probably do really well if you were focusing on long cycle and you added in some pentathlon stuff. Or likewise, if you're focusing on biathlon and you added in some pentathlon stuff, maybe once a week, things like that would probably work really well for that um, indirect or um, less focus on the pentathlon. So, like I mentioned before, it really comes down to your weaknesses. Obviously, you've got one and two bell pentathlons these days. I'll sort of focus on the one bell um, because that's a bit more common. Um, the RPMs there are usually higher to optimize your score. So that's just something to consider. But because it's multi-switch, often the grip is more forgiving and it's more about that general work capacity and your um, endurance, things like that. Strength is also an important factor. So flexibility, not so much when you've got the one bell, because you can move around a bit. The rack position is much easier. The fixation is much easier, and the multi-switch makes it easier on the grip. So they're probably the main things that come out is your strength, endurance, and your just endurance in general. Because that's also the better your endurance is, the better you'll be able to recover between sets, things like that. So with that in mind, if you were looking at this lifter of the year approach where you're doing all the different lifts, you can have a bit of a jerk focus sequence. So that could be a one arm long cycle into a long cycle. So both of those have a jerk component. And then you do a one arm jerk and then jerk. So they're getting more specific and they're sort of going from the full body um, long cycle, sort of push and pull combo to push only. Um, so the one-arm jerk is also got a higher frequency, so that might help to develop the local muscular endurance a little bit more in the tricep, but it probably wouldn't develop the flexibility. The long cycle is good for the general cardio, but again, because you're switching between long cycle, or sorry, the clean and the jerk, you've got what we call reciprocal inhibition. So you're sort of pushing muscles are relaxing while you're pulling during the clean, and vice versa. I mean, obviously there's overlapping exercises, but if you look at predominantly simply the bicep and the tricep, there might be something there. Um, and again, if you expand that out to a snatch focus, you could start with a long cycle into a double half snatch into a snatch. So again, you've got the first two, which are bilateral exercises. So you don't have that rotational component, but you're getting time under tension, um, 10 minutes. So you're not changing. So you're developing a bit of a base there. And then you're going into the half snatch, which is a little bit more specific. Obviously, the eccentric phase is a bit different. Then we're going into the snatch. If you want to look more at that, I'd recommend checking out the blog that I did, particularly if you're Australian. But when we come to the pentathlon, if you're doing other events, particularly if it's a one arm, you know, maybe leading into your pentathlon, you do a jerks competition, one arm jerk or jerk if you're doing um, double pentathlon, um, then a half snatch or double half snatch, obviously, if you're doing the one or two event, and then long cycle or the one arm long cycle, which is not specifically one of the exercises, but because you've got a clean and that's one of the ones that scores the most points, it's worthwhile having that in there. And of course, you've got the one arm jerk. So you're just kind of combining that, um, or you've got the jerk as well, I should say. So you're just combining that exercise. So the pentathlon is kind of a broken down version of that. And the pentathlon was originally um, meant to be easier exercises. Valery Fedorenko sort of designed it with strength and conditioning in mind, and he sort of gamified it by giving people a score, and that was meant to be like your strength and conditioning sort of score. Now, if we look a bit closer at pentathlon, if you're training 3 days a week, a really easy breakdown would be to do pentathlon heavy, maybe do shorter sets like 3 to 4 minutes. Then a light one, maybe you could do longer sets, or just focus on maybe the clean and press and one arm jerk and do like 10-minute sets, something like that. And then medium, which is your sort of comp preparation or your comp weight. And that way you can practice the strategic loading and timing. So you're trying to nail your plan. So that would be a specific plan you could use if you're training 3 days a week. Another really nice one is to do a push day where you do your one arm jerk, push press, and possibly clean and press. For most people, the cleans just makes the push easier, the press easier because you have a relaxation component, and the clean's usually not the limiting factor. If you're one of those people that it is a limiting factor, then that might not be the best thing to include in your push day. But then pulling, again, you've got your half snatch and your one arm cleans or cleans. Again, if you're doing double or single pentathlon, they can be incredibly taxing, particularly the cleans. So that's something to consider. So I don't necessarily mind just having the two exercises there. Of course, you can increase the volume or whatever you need to, and then you go into your pentathlon day. So you could probably go a bit harder on the push and pull. Again, you've got fewer exercises, and then full body. So they're the two examples of how you might look to tackle a direct pentathlon split. If you were using an indirect approach for the push and pull, maybe you could do a push day, doing just bilateral jerks. Pulling day, you're doing snatches, and then full body, maybe you do biathlon with a little bit of some of those other exercises as accessories. And another approach there would be on your push day when you're focusing on the jerk, just start off with some clean and press, develop that specific pushing strength. You probably don't need to really work too hard on the push press because that will be taken care of as long as you have the technique. Um, or you could just add in a couple of sets there at the start of the push day. Again, on the pulling day, you could start with some cleans before you go into some snatches. Um, Again, just if you're doing double pentathlon, do two-handed cleans. If you're doing single, you can do one arm. Um, and again, you can go really heavy on the one arm clean. So just bear that in mind that it can be quite taxing. But again, then you can go full body, depending on how confident you are with the exercise. You could either just focus on your um, biathlon training or even potentially long cycle training and just pepper in a little bit of pentathlon, or you could do just a full pentathlon that day. That would be an easy way to do it. If we break it down into a 4-day thing, it would be pretty easy just to do, again, you can do the pushing pentathlon exercises on the push days and then the pulling on the pull days. Or again, maybe you start off with one day where you do cleans and push presses into jerks as your main sort of working set if you're doing the indirect approach. And then the pulling days, you're sort of mainly focusing on snatch, but you've got the half snatch and cleans at the start. So you get the idea, and you can sort of alternate between the two. Um, Now, more of another sort of alternative. So instead of having the push and pull for the 4 sessions a week, you could do a push, pull, and then 2 full body, one contrasting and being light for the full body, and one being heavy. Um, and you can focus on the comp weights for the pushing and pulling. I should say, if this doesn't make sense, please check out the video on YouTube where I've sort of got this outlined. Um, then lastly, you can even break it down into all the different events. So you could do full body, but just work between different events. So you could do four full body sessions. Maybe do cleans and jerks one session, half snatch, push press another session, clean and press. Some people really like to focus on that. You could do that on session 3 and then a pentathlon. So there are some kind of different approaches there. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, let me know. I can write a blog about it. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Cheers. Bye.